Welcome, everybody, to another installment of Inside the Federal Way Symphony. Adam Stern here. I have the pleasure today of chatting with Tom Almli, the director of the Federal Way Chorale. And we're going to be collaborating this December on a sizable clutch of choruses from parts 1 and 2 of Handel's Messiah. And I wanted to open it up by talking about Handel and his place in the pantheon of great composers. I think if somebody were to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to name you the 10 greatest composers of all time, Handel would likely show up in that list. And at the same time, if you talk to the average but knowledgeable music lover, you say, what did Handel write? Oh, well, there's Messiah, there's the water music, there's the Royal Fireworks music, there's some concerti grossi. And this is a man who wrote hundreds of pieces and yet is really known by very, very few. And Tom, so I'm wondering, what is your experience as a choral person? What sorts of things have you found people know or don't know about Handel, or are they sort of across the board sweetly as ignorant as the rest of us?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for having me, Adam. And it's a pleasure to be here with the symphony. I think that, you know, in my experience, most choral people are very familiar with Handel's oratorios in particular, and less familiar with the many, many operas that he wrote. And however, those that have sung classical voice as well and studied in a studio certainly are aware of a lot of those arias and operatic work as well. I think probably most choral folks are less familiar with some of his instrumental works, other than perhaps, like you mentioned, the water music and a few of those big ones. One of the things I've always wondered is, did Handel want the Messiah to be his opus? If you read a lot of his writing, letters and so forth, it seems like probably not. Versus, say, Brahms, who, when he wrote the German Requiem, he was writing that with that particular idea in mind, or even Bach and the B minor Mass. And so I've often wondered, you know, if that isn't his opus, what would he have liked it to be? But I think a lot indicates that Handel did have a great love for the Messiah, because he performed it so many times and he revised it even hundreds of times. So, and often he would revise it, as you know, based on the forces that he had to play and sing in any given town or city within the British Isles.
There are some anecdotes that we know more about Handel the person than we know about Bach, probably because he was a much more public figure. He was out there promoting his work, as opposed to Bach, who was a much more insular figure. But there's a lovely story I'm sure you've heard, where there was a performance of Messiah, and the fellow who produced the performance, who probably the equivalent of today's cigar-chomping Hollywood producer, said to Handel afterwards, that was such a great performance. The audience was so entertained. And Handel said, I didn't want to entertain them. I wanted to make them better. It's very poignant. I mean, you know, I'm not out there to make these people whoop and shout. I wanted to reach them. I wanted this work of art to get into their soul and make them feel and think deeply. Very, very touching story, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it seems to indicate that even though it wasn't a thing of that era, that Handel was really mindful of the public and impacting the masses, as opposed to what most of that music was actually written for. And it's an interesting comparison you made with Bach. I think I'd always be curious, if we polled our audience, how many people know that Bach and Handel were born within about 60 miles of each other in Germany.
In the same year.
in the same year, and then they died very, very close to one another, and also both went blind from macular degeneration. So many similarities, probably because the way they wrote music was similar by candlelight with a feather and quill and all of that. But yes, Handel was a pretty cosmopolitan person. Bach worked really only for the church, with a few rare exceptions. With regard to Bach, though, you know, unless you went to one of his Lutheran churches or were at the St. Thomas School or something, he wasn't really well known outside of that circle. Handel was fairly well known in Italy from having spent so much time there. And then obviously, you know, the majority of the latter part of his life in England. It's also interesting when you read about him, how poor his English speaking was, that he had a very thick German accent, and actually they say spoke French much better than English. And so that was a very common language at the time to speak in England. And so he preferred to speak in French to most people in conversation.
And when we summon up our dream ideal composer, you know, the one who's tortured and waiting for his muse to speak to him, we always think of Beethoven, you know, the poor tortured soul of a composer. And I think it's, you know, I would guess, as great as Handel was, that most people would put Bach above him in terms of their greatness. You know, maybe not by that much, but when Beethoven was asked who he thought was the greatest composer, he always said Handel. That the famous quote was, "To Handel alone I bend the knee." I think on his deathbed, Beethoven was given a volume of Handel to study, and he took the book and he said, "This is the truth." You know, he loved Handel, so there was something in Handel that to Beethoven represented an ideal in music, and I always try to remember that when I'm studying Handel, when I'm performing him. Not that I want my Handel performances to sound like Beethoven, but there's something in there that appealed to Beethoven that I always try to find.
Yeah, it is interesting that they say in the lore that the last thing Beethoven spoke on his deathbed was about Handel, actually. So he definitely had a love for him. One of the things I've often wondered is how much Bach and Handel knew about each other and their music. Handel was known, as you know, for parodying and borrowing music of others. Which was common practice at that end of the Baroque era. But it seems that he never did do that with Bach's music, and has always caused me to wonder, well, how well did he actually know Bach's music? They definitely, as we mentioned, ran in different circles, and Bach was anything but cosmopolitan. And it's interesting, you know, Handel did have some close friends, and he borrows their music almost as a tribute to them. Kuhnau comes to mind, and certainly there were a lot of others. But I've often wondered what would happen if composers like that had collaborated on something, you know, like, say, Bach and Handel. People have marveled, how did he write Handel's Messiah in 24 days? And he was very prolific, as we all know, of writing quickly. He wrote about two and even three sometimes oratorios a year, and they're all in the same length and scale as the Messiah. And, you know, so the same deal with Samson and Saul and some of those really long oratorios. He wrote those very quickly because I think that was just his process. He preferred to sit down and get it done. Who knows how many hours per day he wrote, but obviously a lot. And part of that was borrowing. He had just written an opera about 6 months before the Messiah that he used several, or four, I believe, of the duets from that opera, and inserted them into the Messiah. And so For Unto Us a Child is Born, for instance, is just a lift of that. That's a soprano duet from that opera. And so one wonders, was that for timeliness, or did he just think to himself, well, this is such great writing, I need to use it. And it is, I believe, amazing writing, and is worthy to be not just a soprano duet in an opera, but also used in that fashion.
I'm a shameless romantic, and I love Stokowski's orchestrations of Bach's organ works, and I am going to take a very subjective, maybe what we would now call old school approach to Messiah. You know, when I grew up listening to Baroque music, it was recordings by people like Stokowski and Barbarolli and Carl Ristenpart. So it may not be what is now considered a purist's Messiah, but I promise it's going to be heartfelt.
Well, that's great, and you know, there's plenty of historical support to say that it's hard to argue what the historic purist version of Messiah was, considering that Handel himself at times would use a small orchestra and choir of 16, and his final performance there were hundreds of singers and a huge orchestra. So I don't know how much of a purist he himself was. You know, again, what would he have done if some of the instruments that had not yet been invented were at his disposal at the time as well? And so I think that there's a lot of license, especially with a piece of music that lends itself to such a wide scope of. I have always found it interesting that some people say they don't like the giant, you know, 2,000 voice choruses of Messiah because that wasn't the style of the Baroque period. But then there are others that might say, well, the style of the Baroque period is not nearly as romantic and exciting and so forth. So I've always felt a joy in romanticizing all of the music that we do as much as possible if it touches our audience more profoundly. So I'm excited to see what you and the symphony do with that. And I know that the chorale is excited to be a part of your concert as well.
May it be the first of many.
You bet. Thank you so much to the Federal Way Symphony for having me as your guest. I would like to invite your audience and the Federal Way community to attend both of these concerts, including our Federal Way Chorale Sounds of the Season concert that will feature Vivaldi's Gloria, a few choruses from Messiah, and then some other holiday favorites and goodies. So please join us on December 10th at 4 p.m. at the Federal Way Performing Arts and Events Center.
Thanks to Tom Almli for sharing his musical and historical insights with us. We'd just like to extend an invitation to all of you to come to the Federal Way Symphony's holiday concert on Saturday, December 3rd, 2:30 p.m. at the Federal Way Performing Arts Center. The first half of the concert is going to be 3 very different medleys of very well-known Christmas tunes. The medley compilers are Erno Rappe, Morton Gould, and Arthur Harris. And following intermission, we're going to do a series of great choruses from Handel's Messiah, from parts 1 and 2, culminating, of course, in the Hallelujah chorus. Please come be part of it.